The unconscious mind, the great enigma of psychology that we want to understand so deeply, but which has often remained so abstract, so vague, simply so mysterious that it continues to intrigue and fascinate us. While modern technological developments in neuroscience and cognitive psychology have equipped us to analyze the brain in a depth never seen before, there is still one name that often remains the first to be associated with the unconscious mind. That is, of course, Austrian neurologist and founder of psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud. Freud always craved that groundbreaking discovery that would propel him to the top and ensure his legacy. But great ideas and discoveries are usually built on the shoulders of giants from the past who left their brilliant thoughts and traces. And as Freud was an avid reader and frequently communicated in intellectual circles, he must have been influenced and inspired by other exceptional minds when he developed his theories on the unconscious mind. One of those exceptional minds might have been the brilliant German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. Freud did think highly of him and even voiced his admiration, as reportedly said about Nietzsche, "He had more penetrating knowledge of himself than any man who ever lived or was likely to live." However, he frequently denied that Nietzsche influenced him and famously claimed that he only read his works very late in life. But comparing their writings on the unconscious mind indicates something entirely different, as there are striking similarities to be found. This raises the question, why would Freud deny Nietzsche the deserving credit despite admiring him greatly? In our attempt to answer this question, we will not only take a closer look at Nietzsche's and Freud's understanding of the unconscious, but also briefly explore the psychological diagnostic criteria for narcissistic personality disorder and how they apply to Freud. In the process of our analysis, we may eventually uncover a cowardly injustice driven by narcissistic tendencies that each of us could encounter in this increasingly selfish world. In 1895, Sigmund Freud, at the age of 43, and physician Joseph Breuer published their work Studies in Hysteria, in which their conception of the unconscious mind was also introduced. Nietzsche's creative life had already ended, as he was battling his severe illness before dying in 1900. So there is a high possibility that Freud, being an avid reader, had already come across and read the works of the famous Nietzsche when he started publishing his thoughts on the unconscious. Looking at Freud's and Nietzsche's works reinforces this assumption, as we will now briefly compare their writings on three important themes. Both of them highlighted that the unconscious mind may be the origin of our conscious thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, with Freud referring to those as part of our psychical activity. Unconsciousness is a regular and inevitable phase in the processes constituting our psychical activity. Every psychical act begins as an unconscious one, and it may either remain so or go on developing into consciousness according as it meets with resistance or not. And Freud was even more direct in another section, as he claimed, everything conscious has an unconscious preliminary stage. While Nietzsche did not state this with the same clarity as Freud, he still proposed that our conscious processes do not initiate anything but are merely the end result, and thus implying that the true cause of our thoughts, feelings, and actions lie deeper within the unconscious. He wrote, "Everything of which we become conscious is a terminal phenomena, an end, and causes nothing." Nietzsche as well as Freud have mentioned repeatedly that the importance of consciousness should not be overestimated for understanding mental phenomena, and therefore indicating that there must be a deeper, more powerful force at play, as Freud pointed out that it is essential to abandon the overvaluation of the property of being conscious before it becomes possible to form any correct view of the origin of what is mental. Nietzsche went even so far as to mostly discredit the power of consciousness over our behavior by depicting it as a rather naive and inexperienced entity compared to the powerful unconscious. He suggested, "Consciousness is the last and most recent development in the organic world, and consequently the most unprepared and impotent one." He further wrote, "The thinking that rises to consciousness is only the smallest part of all this. the most superficial and worst part. Another concept that is closely associated with Freud's theories of the unconscious is the significance of dreams. According to him, dreams are a window to the deep, mysterious unconscious, where all kinds of anxieties, repressed desires, and memories reside. He proposed that the interpretation of dreams is the royal road to a knowledge of the unconscious activities of the mind. Many years before that, Nietzsche had already mentioned the relevance of dreams to understanding our unconscious mind, as he wrote in his brilliant work Human All Too Human. In the dream, this primordial piece of humanity continues to operate in us, for it is the basis on which higher reason developed and continues to develop in every human being. Surprisingly, Freud even acknowledged Nietzsche's work on this subject quite late in his life. While this may suggest that Freud was more willing to credit Nietzsche as he got older, it still remained one of the rare cases of admitting any sort of influence by Nietzsche. The similarities between Freud's and Nietzsche's ideas do not end here, as there are plenty more that would exceed the scope of this video. But still, the question remains, why on earth would he deny the influence of a man he admired so much? The answer may actually be pretty obvious when we consider Freud's ultimate goal. When Freud introduced his ideas of the unconscious and suggested the development of a new school of thought which he coined psychoanalysis, he was not only applauded but also widely criticized for his controversial ideas. One main critique point was that his theories, especially those about the unconscious mind, lacked scientific rigor. Freud, being a qualified doctor of medicine, believed that for psychoanalysis to be accepted globally and stand the test of time, it must be perceived as a scientifically grounded field, which was his ultimate goal, as it would also ensure his own legacy. Now, perhaps if you want to establish your ideas to be perceived as scientific, you may sabotage your own goal if you admit to having been extensively inspired by a philosopher. So Freud's denial of being influenced by Nietzsche could have been due to fears of endangering his goal to establish psychoanalysis as a respected scientific field and thus diminish his chances for a long-lasting legacy. He didn't merely deny Nietzsche's influence, but denied reading his works altogether until very late in his life, further showing how little he wanted his ideas to be associated with him. Psychological research has frequently associated this kind of deceitful behavior with an antisocial personality, with the famous dog triad consisting of narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy often being the focus of attention. In regards to Freud's alleged lying about not being influenced by Nietzsche, we will examine one trait of the dog triad closer: narcissism. The 5th edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders describes individuals diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder as having an inflated need for admiration and a tendency to deceive others for selfish purposes. 9 diagnostic criteria are laid out, from which at least 5 need to apply to an individual in order to be diagnosed with pathological narcissism. While we cannot be sure whether any of these criteria apply to Freud, looking at his biographies yields some interesting clues. In his well-researched book, Freud, The Making of an Illusion, literary critic and professor of emeritus Friedrich Nietzsche examines the life of Sigmund Freud from an unfiltered perspective and unveils a not-so-flattering image. He depicts Freud as being obsessed with success and fame, a rather arrogant individual who thought that he should be admired by patients and deserved the highest recognition from his peers. In his mostly selfish quest, he would deceive and even exploit many around him. Obviously, this is far from an actual diagnosis, but it does point towards narcissistic tendencies in Freud's personality that would further explain his deceitful actions and alleged denial of Nietzsche's influence. While we can't say for sure what the real story is and to which extent Freud might have been actually inspired by Nietzsche, it does point to an alarming condition in our society that was as much existent then as it is now. How often do people carefully select with whom and with what they want to be associated in order to maximize their public appeal and chances of external validation for themselves and their ideas or products? However, it is highly questionable to deny someone the deserved recognition and credit only to maximize one's self-interest. It is not only questionable but simply an act of deceitful cowardice. No one should be ashamed of finding inspiration for their ideas in different fields, as it is this interplay of domains like psychology, philosophy, and neuroscience that will further advance our understanding of human behavior. It is precisely this interdisciplinary approach that may eventually help us to further uncover the mysterious secrets of the unconscious mind. And by exposing the depths of that enigma, we may finally shed light on who we really are.